All right.
Oh, well, they don't have my phone.
Okay, I told you, I promised an outline, although Tammy said, how come you're not doing the, 12 is the Palm Sunday. We could be in Palm Sunday, but I promised you I would give you the outline to this, and so I put it together, squished it in as much as I could. And if we get done with this quickly, which we probably will, because there's not a lot of, okay, what you're going to expect, right, because we're used to it, is we expect to have a semeion, and raising Lazarus from the dead is a huge semeion, but within the structure of this chapter, we did not have a lot of dialogue. So the question that we could ask ourselves, there's a couple of things here, has the style is not maybe the right word because it's still a logos to telos, right? But how is the author then going to give us the next important part, which is the dialogue in relation to Lazarus? And I would argue to you that everything that follows is the logos to, the readers or the hearers in the ancient world in this Greek are going to be thinking the whole time, Lazarus, 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 because that was the last semeion. Remember, just like the previous semeion was the man born blind, and what did we get in Lazarus? I'll go back over it. We got that argument that, if he could heal a man born blind, certainly he could have healed Lazarus, right? That was thrown at him as a curse or a threat or a kind of a disparaging point, right? Okay, so you healed a man born blind, you could have saved Lazarus, and then Lazarus comes back from the dead. Okay, this is the next part. So what we should expect, of course, is the continuation of this logos to tell us about Lazarus, but even more so, let's look for clues. The clues in this are, our author has been what I would consider the perfect, C.S. Lewis would say he's playing the perfect new literature. In modern literature, you put the dialogue and the narrative together, and the New Testament documents are the first real documents in the world that are like that are where they're together, and we've seen that perfectly through the other part. We saw semeion and a dialogue about it. What do we see here? Anyway, let's go over the outline. So the beginning of this is you got Lazarus, and I tried to squish as much as I could. Lazarus in the hamlet of Bethany with Mary and Martha, his sisters. And we don't know about these people before. This is their first appearance in any of the Gospels. Bang, we got it. And it tells us, this is really interesting because this tells us about chapter 12. It's a foreshadowing, which is also an advanced literary technique you don't find in a lot of other writing until this time. You got Mary anointed Jesus. He was that guy. And then it goes on to say, Lazarus, whom you love as a shield warrior, is sick, is enfeebled. Now, this is, again, I didn't do a search, but I don't believe that we have seen Jesus. I don't think we've seen any claims yet that Jesus loved anybody like anything. And the first indication we have that Jesus loved anybody is where John tells us that Jesus loved Lazarus like a shield warrior. He hasn't said that about any of the disciples yet. This is really interesting because, here we are going along in John, And, we are English speakers, so we presume everything. We presume a lot. We presume that if you're hanging around with your friends and your disciples, what? As teachers, we presume that all our students love us. Our students may hate us. Our students may hate the day, maybe cussing the day that they had to take our class, especially if you're paying for them in school. Do you remember those professors and professorettes? I mean, I'm not charging you guys to have class here, so you're probably happy, and hopefully I'm providing you with at least some decent information and maybe some entertainment. But I had teachers that I went to their class, and I'm like, I'm just happy to be here because I'm going to work and get a grade from you, and hopefully it's going to be a decent grade, right? And some teachers, you just were like, what rock did you crawl out from under, right? Worthless almost. But I'm just saying, every teacher presumes that their students love them. Not in the ancient world, I guarantee you, they're realistic. And plus, okay, have you guys ever read about education in America or Europe, English-speaking places back definitely before the 20th century? Remember when they used to put dunce caps on kids and make them sit in the corner? They used to beat them with switches. Okay? I read it. Go ahead. If you haven't, go back and read it. Because it was not unusual for children who acted up to be beaten in school, beaten at home, and guess what? It usually fixed the problem where they ran off like Huckleberry Finn, right? Yeah. Just saying, we have this grandiose view and we put children in timeout now, and maybe not. Putting a kid in timeout can put you in, they might come and arrest you if you're a teacher and do that, right? Have you seen that? Yeah. If you put a kid in timeout and if you send him to the principal too many times, that'll make bad records. So the principal's going to talk to you as a teacher and say, don't do it. I'm just saying, our views in training and education and learners, disciples are much different than the ancient world and what we think. And it is not unusual for corporal punishment to be even used against adults in learning situations, although not as likely, although we read about it. Go and read ancient literature, it's really interesting. But anyway, so Jesus loved Lazarus like a shield warrior. The first time we hear this, Jesus says not to sickness is not to death, and the doxa for God and for the offspring. Says, and this is a comment made by John, that Jesus loved with the love of the gods, agape, Martha, Mary, and Lazarus. So it says specifically that Jesus loved Lazarus like a shield. Now, can you love someone like a shield warrior and also love them with the love of the gods?
If you're Jesus, you can.
Yeah, if you're a god, in the Greek worldview, if you're a god. Now see, this is why, and I want you to remember this, is it really possible for humans to agape? The ancient Greeks would say, no, you can't. However, Jesus provides it as Jesus and God give it to us as an irony. It's an irony because it's something that is impossible to achieve, but yet God calls for us to aim for that. You're never going to make the mark. You're never going, it's a harmantia, right? You're never going to hit the target, but you're supposed to try. This is what is, I think, is totally missed. We miss this. It's a critical aspect in understanding Greek and ancient literature, and also, I think, understanding God. Because in our Anglo-Saxon, our modern Western viewpoint, we can do anything, right? We can love with the love of the gods. We can even be like gods. Right? We're gonna get rid of hunger. We're gonna get rid of we're going to reduce the temperature of the earth. We are increasing the temperature. Look, it's impossible for humanity to increase the temperature of the earth 1.0000% of a degree unless you're lighting a fire and you got it in a building, right? I'm just saying, yes, we can change our environment, but you cannot change the world. It's impossible. So just saying, the Greeks have a very, rational viewpoint. Yes, you can love like a shield warrior, and that is achievable. You can also try to love with the love of gods. And if you're Jesus, you can achieve it. If you're a human being, you can only try. And see, that's the point, right? Yeah, you can't achieve it. We say it all the time, right? We love our children. But every one of us will say, did you completely succeed in every goal and everything you wanted for your children to get? You may have given them everything that they wanted. Did you give them everything you wanted to give them? And that is capability, achievement, right? No, you say, no, I never did. I didn't punish them properly. Or I never gave them the right carrots and the sticks. And you look back in your life, you go, I tried, right? That's all you can do is try, because that's harmantia. That's what I love about this, about miss the mark, right? We aim for the mark. Oh, whatever. I'm being recursive, but I think it's really important, because Jesus loved with the love of the gods Mary, Martha, and Lazarus. He waited 2 days to go to Judea, and it said they sought to kill you there. Remember, that was one of the last points. That's why he went to the place where John the Baptist was baptizing over on the other side of the Jordan at the other Bethany. He was on the other side of Jordan, basically near Jericho. He was near Jericho, kind of north in the Jordan River, and he was in that area on the other side of the river to get away from Judea because they wanted to kill him. Jesus makes this comment, and I have paraphrased it and squished it. He says, 12 hours are not day. And I believe that our translations tell us how 12 hours in the day. But it says 12 hours are not day. In a day, that is. And walking in the day you won't trip because the light of the cosmos. Walking in the night trips because the light is not in him. Jesus says this in answer to his disciples about going into Judea. And the impression we get, in fact, we know the answer to this, because who is the light of the cosmos, according to John? Right from chapter 1. So Jesus is the light of the cosmos. And so he says that if you go during the day, you won't trip. However, if you're walking in the night, you trip because the light is not in you. And the impression is that therefore, if Jesus is with you, you won't trip. You won't have a problem, which is really an interesting thing. And yes, we could take this as for long-term knowledge. I think it's a really important point. In other words, if you got Jesus, you're aiming in the right direction. You have a chance of harmante, of not harmante, right? Anyway, Thomas makes this comment, which is very interesting comment and very Jewish. Let us lead, let us go, that we may die off in company with him. In other words, they think Jesus is going to his death because they're going to Judea. The Pharisees, the Sadducees, everybody's looking for him. And by the way, although the Pharisees get top billing for some reason in the Gospel of John, who is really in charge? Who's in charge of Judea, other than the Romans?
Probably the Sadducees.
Yeah, the Sadducees are the guys. Sanhedrin. Yeah, they have 60 I think there's supposed to be 70 in the Sanhedrin. It means Sanhedrin means 70, the 70. And I'm not sure if they count the chief priest as the head dude, so there's 71. But we know there were 4 Pharisees in the Sanhedrin, is the knowledge we have from the rabbinic documents of the time. One of those was Gamaliel. So, very interesting stuff. And was Nicodemus part of the Sanhedrin? No one tells us, but it's very possible that he would be rare, right? Because he'd be a Pharisee in the Sanhedrin. Anyway, Thomas thinks they're all going to die. That's cool. So I guess all the disciples, they're going with their heads down. But Jesus found 4 days Lazarus had been in the sepulchral monument. He'd been in the tomb. Okay? And the reason I left this term, I think I retranslated the tomb for you, because it's very interesting that John uses the Greek term, where Matthew, Mark, and Luke do not use the Greek terms generally for, the tomb, for example. And also explains to us that the tomb was covered with a stone, which would not be necessary if you were Jewish. So the Judeans came to Mary and Martha with mythic reasoning. I thought that was really cool to leave in there. Martha met Jesus while Mary stayed at home. Martha said, if you were here, Lazarus would not have died. But she goes on, what you might request of God, God will give you. And Jesus tells her, Lazarus will stand up. Will stand. Stand up. And what's really interesting is her statement. Martha says, he'll stand up. We're standing up into the final day. That really shows she's a Pharisee, because that is Pharisaic thinking all the way, which is also interesting to us. We think that when Jesus came in there, he was basically, rushing in with all new ideas? He was giving them some new ideas, but do you see the person he loved, agape, and also the person who was the sister of his shield warrior friend, did not, maybe Lazarus understood it, but Martha didn't. He will stand up with the standing up of the final day, Pharisaic. Jesus corrects her. He says, I am the standing up and the life. He convinced, should not die, he will live. And he goes on, all the living, and he convinced, that is, everyone living and convinced into me, should not ever die into this age. You are persuaded. He doesn't ask, this is not a question. He says that this is really important for us. Jesus says to her that you are persuaded, even if her thinking is not perfectly right. Doesn't this make you happy? What I worry about, and what everybody should worry about, is there are actually people out there in our denomination and other denominations who believe that if you don't think exactly the same way as they do, where are you going? H double toothaches, and they'll throw you the Book of Concord and say, if you believe this, right? Or they'll throw you the funny ones is they'll throw you the Bible and say, do you believe? And the comment should be, not only do I believe, I've actually read it, right? Any case, I think it's really interesting that in spite of the fact that she was not quite right and Jesus gently admonishes her, he says to her, not questioning, remember there's no question marks in Greek, there has to be a question word like T. You are persuaded. And Martha answers, yes, I am persuaded, because you are Christ, the offspring of God who is coming. Now, this is an interesting statement, too. She doesn't say, I'm persuaded you are Christ. She says, I'm persuaded because you are Christ. In other words, she's not saying she's persuaded he's Christ. she does what? She knows he's Christ. What is she persuaded? Because you are Christ, you're the anointed one, I am persuaded. Because you're the offspring of God, I am persuaded. Who is coming? In other words, this is an interesting conundrum for us. We would say, has the Messiah come? What would she say? Why hasn't the Messiah? Why is Jesus still in the state of coming?
He hasn't come into his kingdom yet?
Well, yeah, all these things, right?
It's gonna be.
He needs to be anointed. Got to have anointing. Can't be high king, prince, and king, and can't be the priest without anointing. And also, you got to anoint the sacrifice. You can't be the sacrifice until you're sacrificed. Before you're sacrificed, you're just the lamb being led to slaughter, right? Now, it's interesting that John says, behold, the Doron of God, right? Behold the Lamb of God, the Doron of the world. But yet he's not. He's the Doron, but he's not sacrificed yet. So therefore, he's still coming. When he is finished coming is when everything that is supposed to be done is done. So that, number one, Martha knows her stuff. This is why I'm going to give the woman at the well, she's the number one. Martha's number two. I'm going to give the guy born blind number three. But the guy born blind may not have been super knowledgeable, but boy, he was really, he ran those Pharisees around ragged, right, in the Sadducees. But look at her. What she is saying, and the reason John repeated her words exactly like this is because we are persuaded because Jesus is the Christ, the offspring of God. And by the way, we and the audience all knows this. He's got to be anointed, he's got to take his place, and he's got to be sacrificed and resurrected. Yeah. Even though this resurrection part, okay. There's never been a resurrection in the history of the world. We got a couple of indications in the Old Testament where people came back from the dead, right? And Jesus has raised people. In the other Gospels, there was a couple of, there's the little girl, and there was the guy that was raised from the dead, right? But those are kind of quick because, it's questionable, right? Maybe they would have survived if they had mouth resuscitation. I don't know. I'm just saying, they weren't like 4 days in the grave, right? Yes, sir.
I think the difference is that those other people are still subject to dying.
That could be true too.
Jesus, when he was resurrected, was no longer subject to dying.
Why they call him the first amendments.
Yeah, well, and also the most important point is Jesus is God. Now, who can imagine God dying? Pan died, but it was after Jesus. You know that? There was a Greek god who died. Pan died, and there are mythic things and poetry about it, which is really interesting, that especially that the Greeks had a god die after Jesus died. There's no one, look, things that have never happened in the world. No one has been resurrected, that, especially after, death. We'll talk about death when we get to Jesus part, but when does cellular death occur? Yeah, about 48 hours. When you croak, if somebody if you suddenly fall, dead as a doornail right here, are you dead? Well, if I can get to you, I've been trained in CPR and AD. If you give me AD and CPR, I might be able to bring you back. Okay. So were you dead? No, your blood just stopped flowing or your whatever, but your brain cells were still firing and you still had life in all your cells. And if I get you going again, which by the way, it happens in every hospital every day in America. People that were, their blood stopped circulating, they stopped breathing, right? So you hope that somebody is not a coroner who comes running over here and says, oh, you're dead, you're laying on the ground, and maybe you still are alive. Oh, we'll take the organs, right? That's what they do in China, right?
Or sometimes before that.
Yeah, or something before that.
Or create the death.
But you're not dead technically until about 48 hours afterwards. This is, how do we know? Because science has measured death in people. We know a lot more about death than we know about other things because we've been studying it for a long time. Kind of funny. But for some reason, children aren't educated in this, and schools don't talk about this much, about life and death. Because if you talk about life and death, you might get into a thing about conception and life. Yeah,
when does it start?
And what is, well, by the way, in the documents from the Supreme Court, you know what the Supreme Court says in Roe v. Wade when life begins? They say, obviously, according to science, life begins at conception. That life is not what Roe v. Wade is about. Life, it's, what is it? It's sentience. When does it become human? When does a baby, a fetus, become human? And that is the question that, by the way, if you ever read, and I have read, Roe v. Wade, you'll find that that is the main point of Roe v. Wade. And so they threw a line in the sand and said 3 months. We're to declare a fetus is human at 3 months. And therefore, before 3 months, and for some reason, the government's been whacking kids even past 3 months for a long time. But that's what, yeah. Except they didn't answer the question. When is a human a human? And most people would say 23 chromosome pairs is living. Therefore, when life begins is a conception, because that's what science says, by the way. And any scientist who doesn't say that, and I'm a scientist, is basically missed biology in middle school because they're an idiot, right? And by the way, there are only two sexes, male and female, XX, XY chromosome. This is kind of obvious stuff. Anyway, I'm teaching obvious stuff. Sorry. Anyway, but she said, I'm persuaded of Christ. And then Martha went secretly and told Mary, Jesus is near and calls you. And by the way, John doesn't tell us that Jesus asked for Mary, but obviously he did, because she basically said that he's calling for you. Mary heard, woke up, came to him at the spot where Martha met Jesus, and the Judeans were with her. Those that were in the dwelling, in the home, followed her. And Mary worshiped Jesus. How do we know? Remember, she fell down at his feet. Martha did not fall down at his feet. Martha basically fell in with him and began speaking with him. But it says Mary fell at his feet and worshiped Jesus. If you were here, Lazarus would not have died. The same thing basically that Mary said. This is interesting because at her words, Jesus snorted like an angry horse to the pneuma. He shook down to his pneuma. And Jesus said, where did you put Lazarus? It says Jesus shed quiet tears. The Judeans said, look at how much he loved him as a shield warrior. There's no way they could imagine that Jesus could agape. Loved him as a shield warrior. This highest compliment you could give to another, to a man, that you loved him enough to trust him as a shield warrior. Some said he could open up the eyes of a man born blind. He could have saved Lazarus. Why didn't he save Lazarus? And Jesus is still snorting like an angry horse down to his pneuma. You know, something that Mary said really irritated him. Even though Martha said the same thing that Mary did. And you notice that Jesus did not, it's not recorded that he spoke to Mary in the same way. So I don't know if Mary just wasn't as astute as Martha, or there was a difference. But it is interesting, maybe because Mary worshiped him. That was the sign, right? Because Martha said it. I'm persuaded you're the Christ, the offspring of God, who is coming. You're the Messiah, basically. Instead, Mary fell on her knees, worshiped Christ. So basically, she's saying the same thing, but she did it through her actions. And basically, she was crying too. She was wailing. But Jesus, that got Jesus going. He was snorted like an angry horse. The pneuma shook to his pneuma, and he's still shaking. Of course, the comments by the Judeans are not helping, but he came to the tomb. He said, take up the stone. Martha is there, okay? So the indications are, did Martha stay at home?
No.
She probably went with Mary. And by the way, how much you want to bet that when Mary and Martha were going, that Martha was telling Mary everything that Jesus told her? You know, John says, I don't need to tell you this. It should be obvious to you, right?
You do.
It's two women.
Yeah.
Actually, that is not an unfair comment, because men should be talking more together, right? But we know women do. They share, they talk to each other. You know, it's like a natural thing where guys are, what are they talking about? Sports, you know, football, right? You know, what's wrong with you guys, right? But they were probably talking about Jesus. That may have been why Mary did it, you know, and Jesus is getting really riled up. Says, take up the stone. Martha says, he stinks. It's been 4 days. Jesus says this, if you are persuaded, you will stare at the doxa of God. And he had previously said this. What is interesting is he said this to his disciples, but this is the first time he said it to the women and to the Judeans. If you are persuaded, you will stare at the doxa of God. And by the way, it's obvious that Martha and Mary are persuaded. They raised a stone. Jesus raised up his eyes. Father, I am grateful to you because you have heard me. I saw because at all times you hear me. For the throng I said that they may be persuaded that you set me apart. So in other words, why is Jesus doing this?
To show that he's the Messiah, that he's the Christ, and that people watching believe.
Exactly. You know, it is wonderful that we get the conversation with Martha and Jesus, because this pre-preps us, right? But what Jesus is telling us is, I'm going to show you. I'm going to show you just what I told to Martha and Mary. And I think that's maybe why he's shaking to his pneuma, because, you know, he's agitated, but he wants, what does he want more than anything in the world? For the people to understand and be persuaded, right?
Well, that's if I could just make a comment there, then that isn't he reacting like I've been teaching you and teaching you and teaching you, and you don't believe?
Yeah. Yeah. And you got Mary and Martha and the woman at the well. Okay, woman at the well, she's taking care of everything's cool with her. But Mary and Martha, right? And you know, ladies, okay, first in, right? Last out. You know, in the military, you guys figured it out way before the guys. The learners are still trying to figure out what Jesus said like 2 weeks ago, right? And Mary and Martha are right there, and Jesus is basically saying, I'm going to slap you, right?
Yeah. It reminds me of all the times it said the Jews are looking for a sign. What sign are you going to do? And I can't even imagine what Jesus is thinking. It was like, I could list like 200 signs that I've done. But here he's kind of like, okay, like, other than his own resurrection, like the sign to end all signs. Like, come on, if you can't get it after this.
Seriously.
I'm gonna wave a flag here, pay attention.
Yeah, well, it's really funny that Jesus says, you know, there is more to that. If you go back and read that, and when I talked about it, I told you that Jesus is indicating that he and God are the same. And therefore, they're in constant communication, they're in constant alignment, right? But that Jesus makes his comment that, you know, to God, that he's God, right? He's God, I'm God, we're God. He doesn't need to talk to God. I'm doing this for the people. I'm doing this to show you that you may be persuaded. Period. That's it. You may be persuaded. Jesus shouted with a loud, importunate cry. An importunate cry, which is interesting, right? That's why I left it in there. Lazarus, you come outside of doors. And I told you that's an irony and a joke because the Pharisees swore to kick anyone out of doors, kick anyone out of the synagogue who believed, claimed to be persuaded about Christ, right? Persuaded he was Messiah, everything. And so Jesus says to Lazarus, you come outside of doors, implying that the tomb is like not a good, it's not a good thing, but implying the tomb is like the temple. The tomb is like the Sanhedrin. The tomb is like the synagogue, right? Come outside of doors into the cosmos. I don't know. I think it's really kind of funny. The hearers of this are both astounded and they're probably chuckling. And there's nothing wrong with that. I think that's kind of, you know, we've seen that all through John, right? Come outside the doors. Lazarus came out. He's bound his hands, feet, and a handkerchief around his head. Jesus said, unbind him and allow him to withdraw. Basically, go home. He's going to eat. That's the whole thing. Many were convinced into him. Many were convinced. They were persuaded. However, some went to the Pharisees. This is kind of funny. You know, you notice they didn't go to the chief priests. They went to the Pharisees. They went to the Pharisees. The chief priests and the Pharisees. What do we do? The man makes many semeon. The man makes many signs. If we let him go, all will be convinced, and the Romans will take us in our nation. Take us up our nation. In other words, the Romans, and by the way, you know, it's too late. I don't know why they're thinking and worried about the Romans. The Romans already control the whole thing. They're already paying tribute, right? What are you worried about, right? I mean, actually, the Romans are building aqueducts. They may be borrowing the funds from the temple to build the aqueducts. That's what apparently Pilate did. But, you know, temple aqueducts. You know, especially when you're shedding so much blood for the sacrifices, maybe a few aqueducts would be a good thing. Anyway, it's interesting. But they're worried about the Romans. The Romans already control them, their whole nation. Caiaphas, the high priest of the cycle of the year, the high priest of that year, which is a joke in itself. You do not stare at nothing. In other words, you know, you do not stare at nothing. You can take that exactly the way it's written. You don't reason logically because it brings a profit to you, which is an interesting statement. That one man should die in behalf of all the people, and the whole nation should not be destroyed. He foretold because Jesus was intended to die for all the people. So the words are really complex and interesting in the way that Caiaphas says them, but you know, we get the same, it's the same impression that we understand from our translations in general, although I think it's a little more complex. Caiaphas is making a lot longer argument to them. And by the way, it doesn't say that he responds. It says that he makes a logical argument. So we wish we had the whole of the logical argument, but John gives us the burned down part. And by the way, why do you think John knew exactly what Caiaphas told them? We're going to learn later, but John is a acquaintance of the high priest. We don't know which one. Ananias, Caiaphas. It doesn't tell us, but we're going to find that John invites Peter into the high priest's house when Jesus is being interrogated there. And we'll talk about the connection when we get back there. Anyway, they took counsel they might kill him outright. Now, this is interesting. Okay, he foretold because Jesus intended to die for the people as the sacrifice, as a Messiah. They did not believe the Messiah. Remember, goes back to the Maccabean point, right? The Apocrypha that we throw out, which is like part of the Bible, and Martin Luther's Bible, every Bible until 1826 included the Apocrypha. And the Apocrypha in the Maccabees tells us all about the Maccabean thing and everything. And in the Maccabees, the Maccabean kings were declared and anointed as high priest and king. And so the Messiah, they were each supposed to be the Messiah, except they died. Died dead. The expectation at this time of the Jewish people was that the Messiah would be high priest and king, and he would, before he died, what would happen to the nation? They'd kick out all the bad guys, even though they invited the Romans and they invited the Greeks, they invited everybody in. But they would kick out all the people they didn't want, and they would be their own place and their own rules and be able to do what they wanted to do or whatever. And so, be ruled by their king and, would have a headship of a kingship. Now, I don't think they thought much further than that. I mean, so you have a Messiah that brings back your whole nation state, but then he dies, right? And this is the Maccabees, they had 7, right? Yes, sir.
Plus, do you really want Herod running things? He's not much of a ruler as it goes. He's just kind of a figurehead.
Well, Herod was pretty smart. Herod the Great was pretty smart. The Herod we have now is not Herod the Great. He was one of the sons of the 4 sons. The other ones so far have been like, killed accidentally by the Romans or sent off to Gaul, for vacations. But Herod, Herod is the head tetrarch of the Galilee and the northern part of that area. And he, is an Edomite. And no Edomite until the last generation of Edomites will ever be in the temple, right? But yet, so Herod the Great was really smart because in about 4 or 5 BC, he had them destroy all the records in the temple so that no one knows the lineage of the kings, the lineage of the people of Jerusalem or Israel, and no one knows the lineage of the priests. I could fix this problem, right? And even the microfiche are gone. No computer records, no microfiche, nothing. It's all done. So the only way you can tell is genetic records today, and I don't think anybody wants to quite do that. That could be interesting in itself. Anyway, so yeah, Herod is not supposed to be the king, but what's going to happen to the Messiah? The Maccabees weren't really supposed to be the high priests. Jesus is the only guy that we know. And by the way, how do we know that Jesus' lineage? Because Jesus was born in 6 BC, 5 or 6 BC, and in that period, we know the lineage of Jesus. But after that generation, the records are gone. So isn't that interesting that we have the lineage of the Messiah in that generation? Yes, ma'am.
So how did some of those records survive the Babylonian destruction? Because we talked about that before too. How the Babylonians destroyed the records, and then everyone wanted to be Cohens when they went back and all that kind of thing. So there must have been some somewhere that were saved to this point. If there was more to destroy by Herod later.
We're not sure if the Babylonians destroyed the records as much as they took them home with them. Because, you know, when you're what do you call it? When you're pillaging, right? Right? When you're pillaging and you see papers, number one, papers are like gold, right? So you see papers, what do you do? And by the way, remember, they took all the males and they castrated them. So they took all the royalty and maybe the priesthood, and they took all the women. And so when they took the guys, you know, they took the guys to be their serifs, to be their guys, their managers, right? You know, they don't have anything else to do. Don't have any families, whatever. So we're going to do this. And so all those guys they brought to Babylon, you know, they were not able to reproduce. And so the women were, and it's interesting. So you say, well, how did they continue the generations? If you remember, the Jewish line goes through the female, not through the male. So
Maybe the Essenes kept records, didn't they?
Essenes probably didn't exist at this point yet. Yeah, they were.
More a reaction to like the Maccabees, right?
Yeah.
In that period of time.
Yeah, because see, the Essenes really got their start when Jonathan, if we had our Maccabees, they took our Maccabees from us. If we had our Maccabees, we'd know that Jonathan, one of the high priests at the time, the high priests were becoming super Hellenized. And the high priest Jonathan, when he became high priest, said, I'm going to stop this. Well, that caused a serious problem for him. And, you know, the priests didn't want to stop being Hellenized. They were trying to undo their circumcision, by the way, which is really interesting, because they wanted to participate. What is the priests wanted to participate in the gymnasium, and they wanted to get education and all this stuff. And so it says in the Maccabees that Jonathan took his ball, he was high priest, and he was, you know, depending on who you read, in Maccabees 1, I think he went on his own. In Maccabees 2, they kicked him out. But he went out and formed the Essenes, because the Sadducees of the time, by the way, remember, the Hasmodeans, the Maccabeans, right, were not of the lineage of Aaron. They were Levite. They may have been Levites. They claimed to be Levites, okay? But they made their sons, the sons of high priests, which is totally illegal, right? So Jonathan, who was apparently the real high priest of the high priests, right, said, hey, this ain't right. Well, what do you think the Maccabees did? Well, you're going to accidentally die in your sleep, right? Pillow, pillows. You know, a knife will accidentally fall from the rafters and like kill you. You know, so you know the Maccabees could not have, you know, an insurrection like that. That's a real insurrection where you say, I'm the high priest and you're not the high priest, and you really are the high priest. So what do? You take your ball and you run. That's what the Essenes did. That's what the high priest did. So, and by the way, the high priest continued sacrificing with the Essenes in the Essene temples, which was illegal. Oh, but anyway, so there's all kinds of stuff politically going on here, right? And the high priests of this time may or may not have been from the Aaronite lineage. But anyway, so the Babylonian documents, remember when the Persians took over Babylon, right, through Darius, and Darius, or Darius's son, allowed the Israelites to come back. And when he did, apparently he didn't let them bring back any of the gold or silver, much of it from the temple, but he let them bring back stuff for the temple, right? Apparently documents and things. So they probably had the documents, the Old Testament scrolls and things like that. And this is where the late rabbinic period, the late synagogue, almost everybody the synagogue theory is, where did the synagogue theory happen, right? Where were synagogues created? Now, synagogue is Greek, so it's a late word, but most likely the synagogue was created in Babylon, in Persia, because they wanted to educate the youth, and also who were doing the education? Those castrated Jewish guys that came over, right? Now, we're talking about generations and generations so later. So now they have families, now they whatever, but they are the educated class in Persia. They're the ones doing all the stuff. Like Esther is a really interesting document. Written in Aramaic, which the Persians were Aramaicized. They did Aramaic. Isn't that interesting? So you have Aramaic document where some of Esther, Esther is written generally in Aramaic, but there are also Greek copies of Esther. So do you see this? It's really interesting. There is a Hebrew Esther or Aramaic Esther that is accepted in the Torah, the Tanakh, and we have it in the New Testament or the Old Testament. But there is also an apocryphal Esther, which you ought to read, which is Greek and Aramaic, mostly Greek, but the Greek. So it was obviously written kind of for a kind of general audience, right? The Persians were not quite Hellenized, but yet you got a Hellenized Esther. And we know from Esther that the Hebrews were really providing a lot of services, that is educational, managerial, whatever, so much so that, and they probably helped the fall of the Babylonians to some degree, because Darius loved them. They're really happy about Darius, right? Darius is really happy about them to the point that he let them go back. He let them go back. He also let them screw up a lot, but that's okay. That's another story. But anyway.
Ezra chapter 1, by the way, it does say that Cyrus brought out all the vessels from the temple and accounts for them with the numbers, and says all that were brought with from Babylon were sent back.
And they were all sent back? Yeah, I wonder how much was sent back. But anyway, yes, we can presume that the writings were. Yes, sir.
Just a timing. So when did they rediscover some of the Leviticus writings from Moses? They found them in a.
Yeah, like Josiah's reign.
Was that after they came back?
No, that was before.
That was
That
before.
was,
Okay, I'm sorry.
yeah, that was in
Oh, no, that's good.
Josiah's reign, I think.
Yeah, Josiah.
Yeah.
When they rediscovered the documents. Yeah, that in itself is very interesting.
That's interesting. Yeah, exactly. What were they reading all this time, or nothing? I guess.
Well, see, this is the thing. The early synagogue, which I kind of am if I were a rabbi, I'm not a rabbi, but if I were a rabbi, I'd be an early synagogue rabbi. In other words, I would believe that Josiah's reign is when the synagogue started, because they felt a huge need to train the people into reading, right? Or to this memorizing the scriptures. So a lot of rabbis believe that in Josiah, in that period, is the early synagogue. That's when the synagogue started. The late synagoguers believe that it happened when they were in Babylon, as a response to Babylon and leaving the temple. So, there are even others who believe it was earlier, but there's no validating, because Josiah, there would be no Josiah if it was even earlier than that, right? When the separation of the two kingdoms. And some go, well, maybe the synagogue system started with the separation of the kingdoms, but I think that's really, that just wouldn't happen. Anyway, because Josiah wouldn't happen. Anyway.
Because they wouldn't have lost the law.
Right, they wouldn't have lost Tanakh in the Torah. Yep. Anyway, this is really cool stuff, right? The interesting thing about an outline is you can look back at all these things. So they took counsel, they might kill him outright, which is really interesting because that was the whole point. but they couldn't kill him outright, right? We'll find out that later. It says Jesus no longer went among the Judeans. He went to Ephraim. And Ephraim is in the lonesome place. It's just south of Samaria. And this is what I told you before. What a great place to be. Jesus probably felt that where he was with John, the area of John was too far away from the main areas. Where, by the way, if he went to that area in Samaria, he would have great contact with Samaritans, with Greeks, with the Jewish people, and be very close to Jerusalem. I showed you in the maps. Anyway, this is a continuation. The split was interesting because this continues, and it should have probably been split here. Near Passover, many went to Jerusalem, and I wrote this specifically out of Ephraim to purify in the temple. And they said in the temple, what if he know not comes to the festival? And we know in Greek that is not ever. He doesn't ever come to the festival. Because, okay, every Jewish man has got to come to the festival. So, Jesus came to raise Lazarus from the dead. He's going to come for the festival. They should have known the answer to this question. But anyway, this is a setup because the Palm Sunday poem thing comes next. The chief priests and the Pharisees ordered if anyone knows where Jesus is, they should tell him so they might capture him. They might squeeze him. I think that is, that's the end part of that. Now, we can continue just a little. We have like 3 minutes. And I think that what I wanted to do, let's see. Here's old Mary. So let's get set up for Mary. She took a okay, remember I told you, you got to anoint Jesus. And what's interesting is you notice, okay, if you're a Hebrew listening to Jonian account and they get to Lazarus, what's the question you're asking? Even before John tells us. When was Jesus anointed as the Messiah? Christ means the anointed one. Messiah means anointed one. You can't have an anointed one if he's not the anointed one. I mean, I don't care who you are. You're running around, you're going, I'm the anointed one. When were you anointed? I don't know. Who did it? I don't know. Right? You got a problem here. So, the minute we get, you notice what John does. I think that this Lazarus account, the Lazarus history, all right, the historical account of Lazarus. I think that I told you, they want to know more, right? And I told you that in the ancient world, we really need to understand ancient world documents, okay? And I think we may be getting back to a reasonable understanding of defamation, I'm hoping. Because you had that guy on the comedian making defamatory jokes about the royalty, and the royalty are sending letters now saying that was direct defamation. And by the way, it is. If you say someone's having an affair and they're not, and you think that's a great joke, you're making a joke about the person, that is direct defamation. In the ancient world, people were very cautious of defamation, especially when you wrote it down. So why would you not have the Lazarus accounts in Matthew, Mark, and Luke? Because Lazarus is probably still alive when they're written. Mary and Martha are probably still alive when they're written. And, what did they do? They turned them into parables. They turned them into other types of accounts for them. Not because they're trying to obscure it, and it may have been truly historical points. But if you mix them up like that, what do? You get rid of the defamation and the potential problem that you're going to have. And plus, remember, the Greeks care about logos to telos. They're not about what we want, which is we want to know when the sun rose, when the sun set, if the ground was wet, if the people were, if their feet were dirty, if you had dirt between your toes. we want to know all those details, right? But the Greeks would say, and we want to know who was there. We're going to see that when we get to the counts, who was with Mary, Magdalene, when she went to the tomb. Well, John tells us she went. But guess what? In the next thing, we get we's. So obviously, there were other people with her. Why didn't the Greeks care? It didn't matter. Yeah. The logos to tell us was the logos to tell us without that added information. So if you remember this, and we are going to start with this next week, and this will be, the anointing of Christ, which will lead to, guess what? Once you anoint your high priest and king, he's got to come into Jerusalem. It's Palm Sunday. Anyway, thank you, Father, for your word, for you look after us this week. In your name we pray, amen.
Could it have been a matter, too, of how you say they don't write down the things that everybody knows, that miracle was such a